Welcome to New Atlas Live. I'm Brian Berletic. I will be doing this solo. I kind of threw it together at the last moment. I will be hopping on over to the Red Pill Diaries with Rashid. I have put it into a pinned comment at the top of the chat. Let me just show you what this looks like. This might be a little disorienting, seeing me talking with the delay. Right up here is the link to Rashid's live stream. That will be happening at the top of the hour. Let me close this before we slip into another dimension. And it's also in the video description of this video at the very, very top. So if you want to join me and Rashid right after this live stream is over, and we could go over there and we could do questions and answers. Also, we might do a little bit of that here. Now, of course, the obvious, and this is Rashid's his live stream waiting to start, just FYI. So obviously what we're here to talk about is the meeting between President Putin and President Trump. This was held at a military base in Alaska. It was highly risky. People are saying, well, see, Brian, you were wrong. President Putin wasn't killed or captured. I simply pointed out the risk, and I said it's also possible that nothing will happen. I also said that this is about creating a Minsk 3 or Minsk 3.0, as Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth was calling it. Just because Russia doesn't agree to that does not mean that that isn't a trap. It's like when you go fishing and you don't catch any fish, but didn't you go fishing? Of course you did. You just didn't catch anything. And the US is constantly pursuing primacy. It has been for over a century. And just because it isn't succeeding does not mean it isn't still pursuing primacy. People have to understand all of this. Just because continuity of agenda is running into brick walls doesn't mean that there isn't continuity of agenda that continues. So people have to keep all of these things in mind. Now, some of the developments that have happened. Now, of course, there was this meeting. Nothing was agreed to. We remember, and I remember doing videos about this 3 months ago, 4 months ago, before the 2024 US elections. I remember talking about President Trump trying to trap Russia into a Minsk 3.0 framework. That has been the plan. They have openly said that is the plan. They have put the pieces into place for doing all of this. I'm not going to read from this again. Everybody should be very familiar with this. This was Secretary Hegseth back in February. He was telling Europe, you're going to send troops into Ukraine. We are going to freeze this. We don't have the resources to fight Russia and China at the same time. We need to freeze this conflict. So that is what they are trying to do. That was the whole point of the conflict in Ukraine. It was not to defeat Russia in Ukraine. It was to tie them up there, create an Afghanistan-style quagmire for Russia, to overextend Russia, and to collapse Russia. And of course, that is all written out in explicit detail in the Rand Corporation paper, literally titled Extending Russia. And if we go to the table of contents, and this is what I'm talking about. If you look here, the economic measures hinder petroleum exports, reduce natural gas exports. All of these also provide lethal aid to Ukraine, support the rebels, terrorists in Syria, regime change in Belarus. They've done all of this. Exploit tensions in the South Caucasus. Even as President Trump was inviting President Putin to Alaska to meet and talk about Ukraine, the United States was exploiting tensions in the South Caucasus, just as was written out in this paper back in 2019. So the US is still pursuing this. Their goal is still primacy. Their goal is still to encircle and contain both Russia and China and everyone in between. They are still at war with multipolarism. Just because there's setbacks, just because they aren't successful, does not mean that they are still not pursuing that as their central objective. That has not changed. As I have explained, it is a structural feature of US power. It is not being done in Washington. It does not change every 4 to 8 years during elections. It is driven by unelected corporate financier special interests. They are always in power. And Washington is simply a layer between themselves and the public. And also everyone overseas that they're trying to subordinate, subjugate, and exercise hegemony over. So we have to remember all of that. And I want to point out here, Measure 1 under geopolitical measures, provide lethal aid to Ukraine. This was all about, let's go to benefits. This was all about recreating the the Soviet Union's collapse following the quagmire the U.S. created for them in Afghanistan. This is the whole point of this. It's not for Ukraine to win and defeat Russia. It's one of many points the U.S. is using to weaken and overextend Russia. And just because that's the plan doesn't mean Russia is going to allow themselves to fall into that trap and to succumb to U.S. designs. It is up to Russia to frustrate that. That is why people like myself and many others raise awareness so people understand this. The more people that understand this is the plan, the more that can be done to circumvent it and frustrate it. It also talks about the risks, though. And in the risks, they're talking about risks to who? Primarily to Ukraine. The biggest risk, let's see, where is it? It should be right at the top. Well, we're all familiar with this document also. I've read this many, many times before. Right here, disproportionately large Ukrainian casualties, territorial losses, refugee flows, and a disadvantageous peace. And that's where we are right now. That is where we are right now. And so the question is the United States done with this option, and are they going to move on to other options? We already see them with Armenia and Azerbaijan. They are continuing this strategy. So nothing has changed about the overarching objective. The only thing that is changing is Russia is forcing this issue on the ground, on the battlefield in Ukraine. We are watching the front line collapse right now. The West is admitting that this is happening. So let's close this. And yes, everyone, welcome. Thank you. It is evening here in Bangkok, Thailand, wherever it is, morning, noon, or night, wherever you are. Welcome. Thank you for joining me. Again, we will be hopping on over to the Red Pill Diaries with Rashid as soon as this live stream is over, there will be a hard stop at the top of the hour. So what was the purpose of President Trump inviting President Putin to Alaska to hold these talks? If it wasn't a trap, that was the greatest fear. Everyone had that fear in the back of their mind. I'm sure even Russia had that fear, and they took steps to mitigate it, or to at least assure themselves that that wasn't a threat. I'm not in the Kremlin, so I don't have access to the same information that they have. But those worst fears were never materialized. But why is the United States talking with Russia, pretending to pursue peace? We saw the picture in the thumbnail of this live stream. In the background of this meeting between President Putin and President Trump, it said pursuing peace. The United States in over a century has never pursued peace. We know they're not pursuing peace right now, so they're lying. What is the purpose of this lie? It is the same purpose the U.S. was negotiating with Iran right before it nominated Israel, who it helped prepare for at least a year to carry out a decapitation strike against Iran. What is the United States preparing Europe and Ukraine to go do? So the plan has been since February, since Secretary Hegseth announced it publicly. Here, it's right here. I can put this, I'm going to put this for people who haven't and they're interested in it. I will post this in the comment section. Just check it out and read it. He talks about, okay, when you want to search a long document, you hit Control F on your keyboard, hold down Control, hit F, and this search field will open, and you just type in the keyword that you're looking for. And Secretary Hegseth is talking about deploying European and non-European, not American, European and non-European troops to Ukraine to freeze the conflict. The only question is, will Russia agree to some sort of territory swap? Will they agree to take the whole Donbas? But whatever they agree to, if the conflict stops, even if it doesn't stop, there's still a possibility that Europe is going to send troops into Ukraine to try to bluff Russia into stopping, hoping that Russia wouldn't dare start a direct conflict with essentially NATO, even though Secretary Hegseth is very careful to say it's a non-NATO mission and it is not covered by Article 5, because they worry about the possibility that Russia will just continue. There will be open war between Russia and Europe. And the whole point of this is so the United States can deal with China first and then come back and deal with Russia later. I saw, before we went live, I saw people talking about business deals between the US and Russia. The United States isn't interested in doing business with other countries. Doing business is just one of these things they do to work their way into another country. They want primacy. They want Russia. They don't want to do business with Russia. They want Russia. They want this to be Turn the clock back to the 1990s, following the collapse of the Soviet Union, where they're just plundering and stealing the country out from under the Russian people. That's what they want. They don't want to do business with Russia. They don't want to do business with Iran or with China. They offer these incentives to draw people in so that they disarm their defensive posture that would otherwise prevent them from advancing this agenda. This is what they do with all countries. So let's see what's going on in the comment section. I tried to interact with the audience. I also want to get these main points out. So anyway, the point is, President Trump wants to make it look like he tried to go for peace. And what Russia is doing, what President Putin did at the summit in Alaska, was construct the perfect off-ramp for the United States, at least to rhetorically absolve themselves from this conflict. I have no doubt that Russia understands that even when the U.S. divests from Ukraine, there will still be U.S. generals running the Ukrainian armed forces. The CIA is still running Ukraine's intelligence agencies. None of that is going to change. If that changes, then yes, the U.S. is actually just completely cutting off and running from Ukraine, completely. But unless they do that, they are still pushing this as long as they can. I'm hearing people say that the U.S. will guarantee Russia that Ukraine will not join NATO. We've been there before. The Budapest Memorandum was supposed to ensure Ukraine's neutrality indefinitely, and the U.S. violated that. They've violated every single agreement that they've ever made with Russia and everyone else for that matter, which is why Russia itself calls the United States agreement incapable. They are, and that's just a fact. Russia's going along with it because they're playing their own game of maybe theater or perception management. They want to give the U.S. an off-ramp, just like the Soviet Union and Northern Vietnam gave the U.S. some sort of off-ramp out of Vietnam. But the reality is the U.S. was forced out of Vietnam because they just outright lost the conflict. They lost on the battlefield. That reality forced them out, and there were off-ramps constructed to let them get out and save face so that they weren't as vindictive as they probably could have been, even though even after leaving, they still created a huge mess in Southeast Asia. And even to this day, they have never given up. So a lot of people have to understand that. The Soviet Union held summits with the United States like this all the time. They've created off-ramps for the United States all the time, all throughout the Cold War. Ultimately, how did the Cold War end? It ended with the United States burying the Soviet Union and then plundering the emerging Russian Federation for years and years until Russia began reemerging as a superpower. And so people have to understand, no matter what happens with this conflict in Ukraine, no matter what the United States says, if the structural realities within the U.S. Power, centers of power, unless that changes, they are still going to be pursuing primacy. And this is just a temporary setback that they will adapt to and attempt to overcome. You have to understand that. Just like the U.S. leaving Vietnam wasn't the end of the U.S. empire, then the U.S. leaving Ukraine in any shape, form, or way, if it's a trap just to get Europe to send its forces in and sell the division of labor, Secretary Hegseth himself announced all the way back in February, or even if they're really interested in just cutting its losses in Ukraine and pursuing primacy elsewhere, it is still pursuing primacy. It's very important that we all understand that. Now, if there's something that you want me to touch on, just put it into the comment section. Even if it's not a question, even if it's just a topic regarding this specific subject that you want me to touch on, just post it and I'll try to catch it in the comment section. People are saying, NATO is finished. The United States is in decline. Multipolarism is on the rise. I just had an argument with someone on X today. They took some sort of offense to me saying that the U.S. will continue pursuing primacy, and then they just listed all the recent setbacks the U.S. had, and they omitted all of the actual successes the U.S. has had recently. The U.S. has had successes. They overthrew the government in Syria, and they have destroyed Syria. They have decapitated the entire senior leadership of Hezbollah. They decapitated at least part of Iran's military and scientific leadership. They are erasing Gaza off the face of the earth. They are preparing to erase Hezbollah completely off the face of the earth. So these are things that they are doing where they are at the moment succeeding. Doesn't mean this will continue. The thing is, this is the challenge that we all face and that we need to overcome. I did see Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov wearing the Soviet Union shirt. I did see that in the news. No, I didn't think the U.S. would murder President Trump in the United States, even though there were 2 assassination attempts on President Trump during the campaign. I warned about the United States one way or another threatening the security of President Putin. Maybe that's what you meant. It was just a typo or something. No, it's not called Zog. People who think Jews run the world, you really need to really need to join us back here in reality. White people are perfectly capable of being ruthless, murderous, power-hungry parasites. Western civilization for centuries has been nothing but that. Long before there ever was an Israel or the concept of Zionism ever existed, the Roman Empire was a perfect example of this, and they kicked all of the Israelis out and scattered them to the wind. And they continued doing exactly what the British Empire did after them and what the United States is doing right now. So people really need to get this out of their head. Israel and Zionism, these are real things, just like Ukraine in its current state and Nazism are real things. But these are members of the U.S. imperial court. They do not run the show, just like the separatists on the island province of Taiwan do not run the show, even though they're given extraordinary support from the U.S. That support doesn't mean that they are running everything. It means they are proxies of the United States, or they're used by the United States. And if you want to test this theory, you just ask yourself, if the U.S. really was a puppet of Israel, why wasn't the U.S. fighting Iran? Why did the U.S. have Israel fighting Iran just a couple of months ago? Why was Israel catching ballistic missiles morning, noon, and night for 12 days? And there was just one symbolic missile strike on a U.S. base that had already been evacuated. Ask yourself that. That's the way it works. Israel is the original Ukraine. If Ukraine survived for 50 years and was as successful a proxy as Israel, they would have as much prominence within the U.S. imperial court as Israel does right now. And at any time, when it suits the United States, if there was a juncture where the U.S. had to pick between global hegemony and Israel, they would pick global hegemony, and they would cut Israel off and sacrifice it to maintain their hegemony. And just be patient. It's almost certainly going to happen eventually. And people often ask me, why does China deal with Israel? Why does Russia have any sort of relationship with Israel? It's because they understand that every single country, whatever your opinion is of that country and its people, is more than just whatever administration is in power at the time. This includes nations like Turkey, also Saudi Arabia even. It is millions of people. And what you are trying to do is create an exit for at least groups of people within these countries to go through and leave their role as a proxy to the United States and give them alternatives. If you attack and encircle someone, and this is in the art of war, if you encircle and attack someone and you give them no exit at all, they will fight to the last man. They will fight to their deaths because you've left them no other choice. This is strategy. It doesn't mean that Russia, China, and other nations approve of what Israel is doing. They're just being realistic about what's going on. All cornering Israel is going to do is increase the already off-the-charts extremism that exists there. People have to understand that. Okay, let's just do a couple of questions and answers. So you'll have an opportunity to ask more questions and answers when I hop on over to the Red Pill Dyers with Rashid at the top of the hour. Does your calculus for the continuity of agenda shifted, or do you think it remains unchanged? It's absolutely unchanged. Again, look at the entirety of the Cold War. The U.S. had many ups and downs. They literally lost the war in Vietnam. They were absolutely irrefutably defeated on the field of battle, and they were forced to leave Vietnam. They were humiliated in front of the entire planet. They were pushing helicopters off the decks of the aircraft carriers because they had no room to put other incoming aircraft. People were fleeing from the embassy. They were surrounded by the northern Vietnamese and their corresponding forces in the southern part of the country before it was fully reunited. And they left in complete humiliation. But ultimately, who won the Cold War? It was the United States. They buried the Soviet Union and they plundered the Russian Federation for years until Russia reemerged. And today, we've watched from, when I say today, I mean, say the 21st century, from the year 2000 up until now, the last 25 years, we have seen nothing but continuity of agenda. From the Bush administration all the way up to this current Trump administration and everyone in between. It has been the exact same plan. Just because the U.S. has plans that don't materialize doesn't mean that somehow that wasn't the plan. It just means these nations that the U.S. is targeting from time to time get the upper hand. And if you look at it, the trajectory of multipolarism, it is ascending, and the U.S. empire is in decline. But there will still be many ups and downs. It's an overall war, but there are many battles to be won or lost or to end in draws. We have to keep that in mind. Just always keep the big picture in mind. And that's what we have to understand looking at this summit regarding President Putin, President Trump meeting in Alaska. We don't even know what the full outcome of this little part of this narrative and this plan will be. We still have to wait for the theater. President Trump says, now I have to convince the Ukrainians and the Europeans. The Ukrainians and the Europeans are clients of the U.S. empire. The U.S. controls everything in Ukraine. President Zelensky is in charge of nothing. He has no base of power in Ukraine. All of his abilities militarily, politically, in terms of information space, these are all given to him by the United States, and at any time of America's choosing, it could be taken away. U.S. generals command Ukraine's armed forces, not President Zelensky. The CIA controls Ukraine's intelligence agencies, not President Zelensky. Nobody in his inner circle controls the intelligence agencies of Ukraine. So if the U.S. wanted Ukraine to accept whatever it is that they claim the deal that they made with the Russians in Alaska, they could do it overnight. President Trump could have, as he said, ended the conflict in 24 hours as soon as he entered into office. He didn't. He had no intention of doing so. He told you he wasn't going to do so while he was campaigning. People tuned this out and they only heard what they wanted to hear. And that is what's going to continue. The only way the conflict is going to end in Russia's favor is that they force it to end. And that is going to happen primarily on the battlefield, but also in conjunction with the emerging multipolar world. This is not just about Ukraine. This is about a global conflict taking place. And Ukraine is just one battle among many that are unfolding amid all of this. I saw some other questions. Yes, so here, this is a great question. A conflict happening, let's just say a conflict with China. Let's forget about which countries will be involved. We don't know. It could be Japan. It could be South Korea. Philippines, the island province of Taiwan, they're all possibilities. Could be one of them, all of them, a mixture of all of them. The point is, again, coming back to, where is it? This one. Yes, this one. Let's just make this the background on my computer. Secretary Hegseth said the Trump administration, the whole plan is to pivot to China, to start an equally senseless, but I would say more dangerous conflict with China than the one that is currently taking place with Russia. That is the plan. This is why the U.S. needs to get out of Ukraine. Not because they want to end the conflict, but because they don't have the resources to fight here in Ukraine and there against China. So they need Europe to either freeze the conflict or to keep it going, one or the other. What they do not want is Russia to collapse the front line and take over all of Ukraine or most of Ukraine or even everything up to the Dnieper River. That would be a disaster for them, because then Russia would have resources to spare, and they could use those resources to confront U.S. encirclement everywhere else along its own periphery, but also to help its allies, including Iran and China. If the conflict in Ukraine never began, I guarantee you that Syria would not have collapsed. That is a guarantee. And again, it's literally written out in the Rand Corporation paper. They put all of this pressure on Russia, hoping that cracks would emerge, and at least in some of these places, collapse would take place. And that is exactly what happened. Do not underestimate the United States. This is all they do. Let's see. I understand the notion of continuity and strategic position, but you criticized Iran, Hezbollah, and the resistance, including Hamas. What are groups like this supposed to do? Well, first of all, Hamas has nothing to do with Iran or Hezbollah. Hamas was created by the Muslim Brotherhood, and it is currently chiefly sponsored by U.S. Persian Gulf allies in the region, not Iran. Has nothing to do. And as a matter of fact, Hamas was fighting Hezbollah and Iran inside Syria as part of the U.S. proxy war being waged against the central government there. So they contributed to the collapse of Syria. They were deliberately put into power in Gaza to ensure no two-state solution ever emerged. They put extremists into power in Israel, and they put extremists into power inside of Gaza, and they used this to create a strategy of tension that kept perpetual conflict going, gave the U.S. An excuse to militarize the region, to continue militarizing Israel, gave Israel the ability to convince its population to become dehumanized and extremist and unyielding. And they have just created this huge ticking time bomb in the region. They've established Israel as a forward operating base for U.S. hegemony in the region using this strategy of tension. So that is completely different, has nothing to do with Iran or Hezbollah. What did Iran and Hezbollah do wrong? You know, I don't know. I don't say that what have I said in criticism of Iran and Hezbollah? I think Hezbollah has done as much as they could. All I've pointed it out is that they're not all powerful. There are limits to what they can do. There are limits to what Iran can do. People don't understand. Iran has been besieged for decades, and so it's very limited what they can do. The only criticism I have of Iran was, and I'm not even 100% sure about this. Iran, while it was just recently negotiating with the United States, should have had all of these high-ranking military leaders, scientists. They should all be on military bases with security, so that Israeli agents couldn't just point an anti-tank missile at their apartment and burn them to death in their sleep. It was obvious the U.S. was going to eventually attack during negotiations. They literally wrote it down in the policy papers, and then they implemented these policy papers step by step, verbatim. It was obvious, and I warned that it was going to happen, and then exactly as I warned is how it happened. It's not because I can foresee the future. I just read their plan, and so it seems almost as if they believe they could talk their way out of it. And in the past, they have, and they've created the conditions on the ground militarily where they believe they had sufficient deterrence to prevent something like this. But what maybe they miscalculated, maybe they were just being sloppy. Who knows? But that is my criticism. Those people should have been locked down on bases. I think Russia should have better operational security. The CIA and Ukrainian intelligence agencies, how many people have they killed in Moscow, the capital of Russia? Because these people are living in their civilian homes out in public where they're easy targets. In the U.S., say after 9/11, I was a U.S. Marine during 9/11. And as soon as this happened, everybody was called back into base. When you're deployed to, say, Japan, if you're an NCO or officer, you have a family, you're allowed to live out in town. When that happened, everybody was called onto base and everything went under lockdown. Russia is in a war with the United States, a proxy war the U.S. is waging against Russia through Ukraine. They're shooting U.S. missiles into Russia, hitting targets inside Russia. The CIA runs the SBU, and they're carrying out assassination campaigns for years now, even before the special military operation started. The high-ranking officials, they should be locked down. There should be better security for them. So I don't know. Every country is different. They have different attitudes towards these things. I don't sit in during the meetings at the Kremlin. I have no idea why they do the things that they do, but just as an outsider looking in, that is a point of criticism, or at least a question that I have. Let's see here. This is a good question. Western weapon stocks are depleted. Pivoting east for war is impossible without a decade of prep. By then, won't it be technologically too late, according to the Pentagon itself? Here's the problem. The U.S. has depleted its weaponry in this war in Ukraine against Russia in terms of armor, artillery, and other land weapon systems. The things that they are not out of are long-range air-launched cruise missiles like JASSMs. This is why when they said they were going to possibly send JASSMs to Ukraine, at the time I said, if they do, it'll probably be a small amount, and it's just to test them against Russian air defenses, because if they start sending huge quantities of these missiles, they will not have them to spare for pivoting eastward. But if you look at what the U.S. has done over the last 3, even 5 years, they've been stockpiling weapons for their war with China, separate from what they are doing in this proxy war against Russia in Ukraine. It's very important to understand it's 2 completely theaters of combat, completely different systems that will be used. The conflict against China will be air and naval, while the one in Ukraine is land-based primarily. And so it's very important to keep that in mind and to see how they have been, splitting and cultivating their resources with this in mind. And they have said this in their policy papers and even during public conferences, press conferences. This is a good question, though. I'm glad you asked that. It's very important for people to understand this. Let's see. Yes, well, a lot of people are saying, I'm looking through the comments, and someone said that, and I was listening to Alex and Alexander of the Duran. They both did separate videos giving their take on it. Alexander made a very good point. He was talking about how Russia brought these high-level officials, that the top officials essentially of the Russian government, the financial system, everything. And it wasn't too necessary. Maybe I misinterpreted this, but the way I interpreted it was Alexander saying they brought these people in to explain, not to explain to President Trump and the neocons that he has surrounded himself with that, what's going on in Ukraine isn't what you think, it's something else. I don't think that's what he meant. I think he meant that we are going to say no when you tell us ceasefire, and then you're going to put sanctions on us. You're going to target BRICS. We have these people here to explain to you that is not going to work. So why don't we skip that step and just go to the next step after that? What President Putin was doing, especially during the press conference, people will say, why is he so polite and kind and charitable to President Trump? President Trump doesn't deserve any of this. He doesn't. But what President Putin is doing is constructing an off-ramp for the U.S. Whether they use it or not doesn't matter. They've constructed it. That is an option the U.S. can consider as Russia continues compelling the U.S. to do something on the battlefield. Russia continues advancing on the battlefield. Let's see, what else? Again, at the top of the hour, we're going to do a hard stop, and we're going to go hop over to Rashid of the Red Pill Diaries. The link is in a pinned comment at the top of the comment section. It's also in the video description, and I will enter it into the comment section again right before we stop and hop on over. Of course, you guys are more than free to ask questions over there. If you want to help out Rashid with a super chat or something, you're more than welcome to do that. I'm sure he will appreciate it. I do not monetize any of my social media platforms. I personally don't like ads. I don't want to give YouTube and Google any sort of benefits from whatever I do. And I am lucky enough to have a lot of people supporting my work through other means. And I want to thank people for that. That's me. Other people do it differently, and you just help out any way that you can. Change the battlefield. Okay, this is a good question, but I don't think I can tackle this here. This is very important, though. How AI will change the battlefield in the future? It's already changing the battlefield right now. And because we're talking about the U.S. and Russia, we kept hearing about how the U.S. and Europe and Ukraine, they're so innovative. Free markets breed innovation, and Russia has no way of competing. But it turns out that Russia is using AI The way they're using AI is there's a camera on the drone, there's AI operating on the drone. There's probably something like a single board computer on the drone running an AI platform. And what it does is it takes the image that it's receiving from the camera and it's making decisions about where it goes on its own. And that prevents electronic warfare from disrupting any sort of signal, whether it's GPS or a signal from an operator at a distance. And this allows the drone to realize where it is by looking at the terrain around it and make decisions as it's guiding itself to whatever target it was tasked to hit. So that is one example. Battlefield information management is another one. There's so much information to manage. And if you have AI aiding in the thinking of commanders, that can be very, very helpful. You don't want them to replace the thinking of commanders. If you use a lot of AI day to day, I think you probably already know all the reasons why. AI has a tendency to make elementary mistakes from time to time, hallucinate things that are not real. And so there always has to be a human, at least at this stage, there always has to be a human in the loop to make sure that they are making rational, useful decisions. And then, of course, as AI improves over time, that impact will expand. Yes, actually, here's another good one. This is a perfect example. Even as the United States is saying it wants peace with Russia, which it doesn't, it wants to freeze the conflict so it can pivot to China, destroy China, and then pivot back and destroy Russia. That is its goal. They said that's their goal. And even as they pretend that they want peace with Russia over Ukraine, they are doing things like creating this conflict between Thailand and Cambodia. And I've warned people, there's a common misconception that Thailand is a US ally and that Cambodia is a Chinese ally. And it's not true. Over the last year or so, Cambodia has hard pivoted away from China towards the US. The US has now sent people to Cambodia. They are on the ground working with the Cambodians. They also control the civilian government in Thailand. They have a client regime in power right now in Thailand. The Thai military and the Thai monarchy are separate institutions with their own influence over policy in Thailand in different ways. And the US wants to remove those institutions because they are independent of US American influence and its agenda. The civilian government at the moment is run by a billionaire who has served US interests for the last 25 years or more. And so it is an artificial conflict that should never have happened, is pointless, it is destructive, and it's meant to destabilize Asia. And the US is pivoting to Asia, and now they're creating the same sort of conflict and instability here that they have in Eastern Europe and all across North America and the Middle East. So it's very important to understand, even as they pretend they want peace with Russia, they are continuing everything else, everywhere else, continuity of agenda. And these are all things that were set up during the Biden administration, and it has now continued under the Trump administration. This is a great question. If neutrality is put back into the Ukraine constitution, how can Russia rely on that? Don't the missiles have to be removed from? Yeah, I mean, exactly. If you wanted to convince Russia you were serious about peace, you would dismantle NATO. NATO only exists to contain and encroach upon and eventually absorb Russia. So if you wanted to convince Russia you were serious about peace, you would dismantle NATO. It has no purpose to exist. It is not protecting Europe from Russia. Europe doesn't need protection from Russia. Russia wasn't threatening Europe. Russia was working with Europe before the US started this whole conflict over Ukraine. They overthrew the government of Ukraine in 2014. They militarized it. They created a national security risk on Russia's borders, a risk that the US would never accept another nation creating on its borders. And that's what NATO is used to do. And even as President Trump is saying, I want peace with Russia, but it's up to the Europeans and the Ukrainians, he can wash his hands of it and pivot to China. And China is a Russian ally. So they're attacking China, which will impact Russia negatively. And they will have Europe and Ukraine continue. Think about the Baltic Sea and how they've been starting to set the stage to interdict Russian shipping through there. Whether they can do it or not is another question, but that's what they're setting up. The U.S. does not want to be involved directly in this, even though NATO, Europe, Ukraine are all proxies of the U.S. They don't make any decisions unless the U.S. tells them to do. And when they are making decisions that appear to be contra to U.S. interests, it's because the U.S. wants to put distance between itself and its own policies. Plausible deniability. They did this with Israel in regards to their talks with Iran, when, in fact, the entire time they always planned for Israel to strike at Iran. Okay, we're going to do a hard stop here. I want to thank everyone who tuned in. I hope this, I'm going to keep an eye on this. I'm going to hop on over to the Red Pill Diaries. I'm going to put the link again in the comment section. If you want to continue this discussion, let's hop on over there. I'm going to go join Rashid offline, and then we will come back live on his channel. Thank you again, and I'll see you in a couple of minutes. Bye for now.